Most people think of superhero movies from the 1980s, they think of Superman soaring across the screen, or maybe Michael Keaton's Batman arriving at the very end of the decade. What they probably don't think about is Arnold Schwarzenegger carrying an entire tree on his shoulder, jumping out of airplanes, ripping a steam pipe out of a wall with his bare hands, and somehow surviving an assault on an island that should have killed him roughly 37 times. Yet, the more I thought about it, and the more I started wondering if 1985's Commando has been hiding in plain sight all these years. Not as an action movie, but as a superhero movie that simply forgot to put its hero in a cape. Now, before you start typing angry comments about how John Matrix doesn't have superpowers, hear me out. Because when you strip away the machine guns, the explosions, and enough one-liners to supply an entire decade of action films, what's left starts looking suspiciously like the blueprint for a comic book movie. And the funny thing is, that may not be entirely accidental. Now, one of the lesser known pieces of Commando trivia is that the film's origins can be traced back to Jeph Loeb, who would later become one of the biggest names in comic books long before he was writing Batman The Long Halloween or helping shape some of Marvel's most popular stories on comics and television. Loeb and Matthew Weisman had developed a very different screenplay. Their version was reportedly a much more grounded story centered around an Israeli soldier trying to leave violence behind. It was a character-driven drama, not an action spectacle, and at one point Gene Simmons of Kiss was even being considered for the lead role. If that sounds like a completely different movie, that's because it was. And suddenly Hollywood got involved. Specifically, Hollywood realized they had Arnold Schwarzenegger available, and once Arnold enters the equation, sudden introspection tends to lead through the nearest exit. Producer Joel Silver and screenwriter Stephen E. D'Souza reshaped the project into something much bigger, much louder, and considerably more ridiculous. The result wasn't merely an action movie, but it was something that operated on the same logic as a comic book. Let's think about John Matrix for a moment. The film presents him as a retired Special Forces colonel, but almost immediately we're asked to accept things that go far beyond what even the most elite soldier could realistically accomplish. Within the opening minutes, he's carrying a tree trunk that looks like it belongs in a logging operation. Later, he jumps from a moving airplane, shrugs off injuries that will hospitalize ordinary people, and spends the climax mowing through an entire private army with the determination of a man who's been told the laws of physics are merely suggestions. The movie never explained how he's capable of these things because, much like a comic book, it doesn't feel the need to. Superman doesn't stop to explain every feat of strength. Batman somehow survives situations that would reduce most people to a fine red mist. John Matrix exists in that same realm of heightened reality where extraordinary individuals can accomplish the impossible because the story requires them to. That's not military realism, that's superhero logic.
I wish he had put on the grease paint and the G.I. Joe clothes a little bit sooner. I think it would have helped the movie. It sags a little for me. The other objection is that when we do get the G.I. Joe sequences, I thought that some of those weren't as exciting as maybe a couple of the car chases that had gone on before. I mean, but what does he do? He blows up some buildings. We see him shot from 4 different angles, blow, 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 blow.
Blows them up real good.
What really pushed me toward this theory, though, wasn't the action, it was the story structure itself. At its core, Commando isn't exactly about war or military operations. It's about a hero whose world is shattered when his daughter is taken from him. Everything that follows becomes a rescue mission driven by personal stakes. That's a superhero story in a nutshell. While Batman goes after criminals because of what happened to his parents, Spider-Man learns responsibility after losing Uncle Ben. Commando's John Matrix launches a one-man war because his daughter has been kidnapped. The emotional mechanics are exactly the same, the scale is different, but the storytelling DNA is remarkably familiar. Even the villains feel as though they wandered in from the pages of the comic book. Bennett, with his chainmail vest and theatrical personality, doesn't come across like a hardened mercenary. He feels like the kind of colorful arch nemesis you'd find battling a superhero every month in a comic series. Honestly, if Bennett showed up in a Batman comic from 1986, nobody would question it. And maybe that's why Commando has aged somewhat better than many of its contemporaries. The film isn't trying to convince us that we're watching reality. It understands that action movies are modern myths, and John Matrix is essentially a mythological hero wrapped in camouflage. The explosions are bigger than life, the villains are larger than life, the hero is larger than life. Everything about the movie operates according to comic book rules, years before Hollywood figured out that comic books would eventually dominate the box office. Viewed through that lens, Commando starts to feel less like the ultimate 1980s action movie and more like an accidental superhero movie, one that arrived decades before the MCU disguised itself as a Schwarzenegger vehicle and somehow got away with it. And frankly, once you see it that way, it's hard to unsee. If you enjoyed this trip into the strange corners of pop culture history, be sure to subscribe to Pulp Vision because sometimes an action movie turns out to be a superhero story, reminding you that not every superhero wears a cape. Some wear camouflage, carry tree trunks for exercise, and throw sword blades at people. See you next time.